Okay, then let's convene our meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, April 27th, 2021. Another beautiful day out there, and we get to sit here at our Zoom meeting, but not so bad. First item on the agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it? All right.
Not for me.
Then we have our meeting as presented, our chair's report. Don't have much to report on. We are having a executive committee meeting coming up. David, what day did we say that was going to be?
It'll be right before the next planning commission meeting on the 11th at 5:15.
All right. So that's the chair's report. Director's report, David?
So we are kind of, now that the election season has passed, we are now kind of more firmly in the throes of planning for the FY22 budget, and then correspondingly our work plan as a department for the coming year. Megan and I met with Catherine Shad, the CAO, a week, maybe 2 weeks ago now. And the basic direction that we've all been given around our budgets is to propose basically back to a pre-COVID amounts. So that brings up all of the money that we had lost for training back to full steam. We have made a request for another position, and we have money in the budget, at least right now, for some consulting services, which will allow us to take on kind of a broader array of projects. So the next focus then is, okay, within that capacity, both financial and staff capacity, what kind of initiatives do we hope to be able to undertake? We have a few things on our kind of work plan and radar that we're working on right now, or that we were working on before COVID hit, that we want to pick up again. Specific to that is the economic development strategy. But if any of you were listening to the mayor's State of the City address, one of the things that kind of falls squarely into our laps is he wants to do another housing summit. And this one focused specifically on housing and racial equity. So we've only had one brief meeting with him about it. We need to have more to kind of flesh out those details, but the basic concept is that we would have two events, one to really kind of gather ideas and issues, throw some ideas out there, get some feedback on, come back to a second meeting, you know, a month or two later with some specific proposals, get feedback on that, and then bring it to the council by the end of the calendar year. Then seeking them to then give us specific direction to go forth and do whatever those recommendations are. So come January, the commission could be seeing then a fleet of recommendations coming through the council for some amendment changes relative to housing. So that's the broad outline. We need to dig into more details about kind of what exactly do we think that might entail. Part of that is related to a project that we're working on with an intern right now to get a better handle on residential development patterns and understanding where there are opportunities for small forms of multifamily housing, what's commonly these days in our circles referred to as missing middle housing, duplexes, tris, quads, where those things might fit within existing development patterns. That's one example. We've also had a meeting, I think it was last week, with Councillor Hanson, who's interested in expanding the no parking minimums in the zoning ordinance citywide. So we'll see where that goes. But between budget and work plan, that's part of our focus. We will be presenting to the Board of Finance on our budget on May 19th. So my intention around a executive committee meeting on the 11th is to have something to bring to you and perhaps bring to the whole commission to talk about that just as an FYI, this is what our budget looks like. This is what we anticipate our work plan to be going forward. Oh, I'll add one other thing to that on that work plan. We are hoping and expecting to receive money from the Regional Planning Commission to do an impact fee study. So that's one task that fits in there. There are a lot of tasks that are on our list, but that remains to be seen. Alex, I think you had your hand up.
Just can I ask a quick question about the existing regulations for residential? Is multifamily not allowed in residential low density in RL?
So in RL, we allow single family in some cases. If the lot is big enough, if the lot is wide enough, we allow for a duplex. And you can do multifamily attached units in a PUD. So you kind of see lots of examples of those that were done in the in the 80s and in the 90s of these condo developments that have done multifamily in RL. But other than that, no, you can't.
Thank you.
David, for our
So
executive
that's
committee,
that's part of what we have on our plan here going forward in the coming months.
Are duplexes, David, conditional and not permitted in RL, for example? I mean, that could be one example of something to make it a little easier.
Yeah, and we're actually going to talk about a couple of these things and the amendments that are on the table for tonight, specific to residential uses being conditional or not.
yeah, that one specifically is on our agenda, actually.
Yeah, but
David, would you
yes.
put for our agenda for the executive committee meeting, would you just put these housing issues? You may have some specific, but just put the broad category on so we could at least be discussing that. I have some thoughts as well, so want to run some by all of you.
Happy to.
Good. Any other questions for David?
Yeah, that's my gist.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, David. Next item is public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to us on any item they'd like. Megan, do you know if we have anyone for public forum?
We do. The first person is Amy Ganya. Amy, you should be able to speak. You'll need to, yeah, there we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm wearing a headset. I think it should be pretty good. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you this evening. I've been looking forward to it. I've had some interaction with Megan around this for a couple of years now. And I appreciate you seriously considering my request. So I own a 3-unit building on the corner of King and Pine Street. To remind you of this area, it's located on the busy downtown thoroughfare of Pine Street, just 1 block south of Main Street. One of the reasons I was interested in this building when I bought it about 10 years ago was because it was very much, in my mind, in a downtown location. So I wrote a letter, it's in your meeting packet, and I'm anxious for you to take a look at that letter because I included an aerial image of the zoning map with the downtown district FD5 additions that were made in 2019. So what I'm here to talk to you about is the zoning boundary amendment in 2019 and the areas that were added to D5 and the areas that were not added to D5, to FD5, sorry. So if you look at that map, so there's red outlined areas, which were the areas that were added to FD5. And then there's a green box, which I added. This area was not added to FD5. It encompasses 3 buildings that face Pine Street, which we believe should have been added to FD5 because of its location on a major thoroughfare very close to downtown. So when I learned of this amendment shortly after it passed, I approached Megan because I was perplexed as to why all of the non-FD5 areas of the blocks to the left and right of our block were added to FD5 with this amendment, but only a sliver of our block was added. The rest of the block remained in residential high density. And I can see, you know, the buildings that are sort of in the center section of King Street potentially remaining in high density, but particularly the 3 buildings facing Pine Street, I thought was just really not kind of in keeping with the direction of the development of Burlington as I've understood it, especially since a property that is very similar to ours, one north of it, was added. So in 2019, I approached the owner of the 2 buildings on Pine Street north of mine, and he has joined me in my request that I'm making today. So I actually drafted the first draft of my letter in 2019, and Megan kindly advised me to hold out a bit because you had just hashed through these changes and perhaps wasn't interested in taking it up at the time. I am approaching you today with the understanding that there is work being done to clean up the 2019 zoning boundary amendment. And I would like to take this opportunity to call your attention to this potential addition to FD5. So, you know, I hold this position because of having reviewed some city documents, you know, including the Burlington's comprehensive plan and, you know, the 2019 zoning boundary amendment purpose statement, both of which identify Pine Street as a major thoroughfare and area suitable to accommodate the city's future growth. You know, in addition to that, there's been, you know, it's removal of parking requirements along Pine Street, which is, you know, indicative of the fact that it is a major thoroughfare, a place of growth. You know, we would like to use our building in a manner that is appropriate with FD5 district. The ever-increasing traffic on Pine Street makes the first level of this building not ideal for residential use, as the noise from the cars and pedestrians is intense and increasing. In addition, our building is positioned so close to Pine Street that the city has actually informed us that they own the land 6 inches into the building along Pine Street. You know, it's back, you know, just a foot off the sidewalk. Because it is on the corner of 2 very busy streets and is highly visible as you approach it driving north on Pine Street, it is the perfect location for a business such as a first level storefront. So I really request, you know, that you consider this. You know, we would like to contribute to the vibrancy and character of downtown Burlington. I mean, Scott has heard me throw around ideas, you know, various ideas. I've asked him about art boxes on the outside of the building. I've asked him about the use of this downstairs location for other purposes, but I actually really do enjoy fixing up this building. And, you know, I've done a lot of improvements to it. It's the only building I own. I work for the state of Vermont. You know, I am not a landlord by profession. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for bringing this to us. Megan, have you been taking a look at this at all?
I've talked to Amy a little bit about this, and I followed up with the work that you all did, that we all did together back in 2018 and 2019 to amend the Form District 5 boundaries. I let Amy know that you know, we would see what the commission's interest level was in considering this request after tonight's meeting, and depending on what, if anything you want to do with it, then we could follow up with more information and a conversation about you know, this request.
Okay.
I know that when we, as Amy mentioned, when we did the analysis of the Form District 5 boundaries a couple of years ago, we did include the parking lot that is on North Champlain Street, right across from August 1st, and one residential, multi-unit residential property on Pine Street. So they kind of make up the northern half of the block that is now zoned Form District 5. And all of the parcels south of that point on both Champlain and Pine, and then all along King, are all residential high density. We did talk about one additional property, actually one of the parcels that is part of Amy's request. When staff brought some recommendations to you for parcels to consider adding to Form District 5, one of those parcels was included, and through our discussion, the commission asked us to remove that from the boundaries that ultimately got recommended to the council and adopted. So I did also just let Amy know that based on our conversations before, some of the factors that you considered were just that kind of nature of residential versus commercial uses along some of these streets, and that was definitely a factor that weighed pretty heavily in your discussions in the past.
Okay, thanks. Emily?
Sorry, I had an issue with the mute. Is the specific request that they want to be able to do retail on the first floor, and that's not permitted in Form District 4, but is permitted in Form District 5?
I am not aware that that's the specific request in your letter. I know that in our conversations with Amy, Scott and I's conversations with Amy, she's mentioned a variety of uses that are allowed in Form District 5 that are not currently allowed in RH. But that would actually be a question that would better be answered by Amy than I.
Well, we're going to be talking about changes to the form-based code. I think that's agenda item 7 for updates on that. Perhaps we could either have a brief discussion on it tonight, just we might have already had it really, your update that you gave us. But it might be worth just seeing if there's a just getting a little bit more background on this. Bruce?
Just one comment, Andy. I mean, neighborhood commercial uses might work for most applicable uses here, would it not? Maybe Scott could answer that, or maybe we can defer it to your later discussion.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Neighborhood commercial uses are possible, but they're limited in size in ways that, well, they're limited in size and the variety of uses that wouldn't, those limitations wouldn't be present with a rezone to FD5.
Okay, thanks. So what I'd suggest is, as we're doing the Article 14 form-based code discussion, let's talk about whether we want to take this one on during that discussion. We'll be looking at various different other amendments to Article 14 then. So Amy, thanks for bringing this to us. Megan,
Thank you.
do we have anybody else?
I don't see any other hands. I think that should be all for us tonight.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll move on to item 5, which is proposed CDO amendment, height measurement, dormers, and eaves. Who is taking this one on?
Okay, these are mine tonight.
Oh, these are all yours. Okay.
You get to listen to me. This is actually a combination of two different amendments discussed by the ordinance committee separately, but because they both relate to building height and how a building's height is measured, we put them together. So there are two components to it. The first one being the starting point of how we measure a building's height. Right now, it depends on how close to the sidewalk a building is, whether we measure it from the sidewalk or whether we then measure it from the average grade of the perimeter all the way around the building. And then there's another section in how we measure height that encourages using an increment as you go up and down the street. So this amendment seeks to kind of bring all these ideas together and kind of refine them and consolidate them, so that at the end of the day, it clarifies that the measurement of a building height is done as in increments along the street facade. So if it's within a certain distance of the street, we use the elevation of the street from where we measure the building's height. If it's set back a certain distance, and I think that distance is 50 feet, then we use the area within 10 feet of the facade of that building. But ultimately, the objective is, how does the height of that building relate to the street where people are either going up and down a hill, and then going up and down the hill if it's on a slope. We don't really care about the height of a building in other aspects. It's how it presents itself to the street. The rest of the height of the building is then going to kind of be derived from there. So this This recommendation came out of the ordinance committee at their March 4th meeting to the commission. The second part of this has to do with dormers and eaves, and the extent to which the end point on the top of the building, do we include measurement of a dormer? Because that will change the height of the building depending on the size of the dormer. The ordinance doesn't offer any guidance to that. It also doesn't define what an eave is, even though it's an allowed encroachment into a setback. So this amendment identifies when a dormer is used as the measurement point. Basically, how big is that dormer on the roof of that street-facing elevation, as well as defining the use of the term eave and including some design standards relative to it. So that's the brief summary of this amendment. I'm happy to go into greater detail on it if you have questions.
Thank you. And you said the ordinance committee looked at this?
Ordinance committee looked at both of these and unanimously recommended them.
Okay. Alex, is there any report or anything from, you're not chair anymore, are you?
I am not on that committee.
Who is our committee?
Bruce?
Bruce.
Emily and who else is that? Oh, Eves and Matt.
Speaking of eaves, sorry.
Any report from the ordinance committee?
We didn't do a formal report. I think David did the best explanation that we've had so far. It took us a while to wrestle with it because the wording was really, really hard to understand at first. It took us 3 meetings to understand it. And we haven't done a formal report, but that, I think we decided to go by this principle, which is a certain distance from the street to have it measure up to the streetscape as best we could.
That's great. Thank you. Any questions, comments from the commission? David, I don't know if there's a easy answer to this, but what's the practical impact of this compared to the ordinance now? Will this result in shorter buildings, taller buildings? It really depends on what impact it has, or just what's the practical impact?
You know, I think the practical reality is that it just clarifies how the building's height is measured. It doesn't really mean the buildings are going to be any bigger or any smaller. There are just some quirks in both. If the building's close to the street and we measure it from the street, how that relates to then if the building's farther away and is more isolated. If we're measuring it all the way around the perimeter of the building, which was one of the examples was the one of the Cambrian Rise buildings, you know, it doesn't really matter what the height of the building is in the back. It matters what the height of the building is in the front, and that we want that height of that building to stair step up and down a slope. That's kind of the key principle. We wouldn't want it to be inordinately short on the upper end of a slope and inordinately tall on the lower end of the slope. We want it to mimic that kind of pre-construction topography.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? Staff recommendation here is to approve the bylaw amendment report and warn for public hearing.
Correct.
So that's an option of what we could do. Anybody wants to do that? Make a motion?
I'd like to make a comment and
Okay.
then a motion that I just learned that the reason for the iconic mansard roof line of 1860s Paris was because the height limit was measured up to the cornice line. So they figured out how to get another story or two by building those mansard roofs that step back from the cornice. So I don't think that's what we're about here. I would call this like a deference to David, a Scott Gustin classic of redefining the rules where they weren't defined before. And so I'd like to make a motion that we warn it for public hearing with the accompanying report.
And approving the accompanying report.
Yes.
Yes. So there's a motion by Alex. Is there a second? Anyone want to second this?
Second.
Okay, seconded by Jennifer. Any further discussion on it? See none. All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that seems unanimous to me. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Item 6 is proposed CDO Amendment Act 179 changes.
So last September, the Vermont legislature passed Act 179, which amongst a whole bunch of other things was included some changes that were intended to promote greater access to affordable housing. For Burlington's interest, there were 3 particular aspects of this bill that touch on our zoning regulations. First has to do with the definition and requirements for an accessory dwelling unit. Another has to do with pre-existing small lots and whether or not they development can be prohibited, the conditions under which development can be prohibited on them. And the last has to do with kind of this long-standing issue that you've heard of over the years in using character of the area criteria in conditional use review. And in this case, the statute prohibits a municipality from using character of the area as a determining factor in denying dwellings with 4 or fewer units under a conditional use review. So all this means that we needed to go back, look at our zoning ordinance and make sure that we bring it in alignment with the statutory enabling legislation that it has to fit within. Back in February, you may or may not remember, we discussed all of these items. The commission as a whole supported the staff's changes applicable to accessory dwelling units and existing small lots. So this, again, this takes out the, with regard to accessory dwelling units, it takes out the concept of it being a 1-bedroom apartment, an efficiency 1-bedroom, and the number of occupants that are permitted in it, and affects the size. We have a limit of 800 square feet or 30% of the gross area. In the statute bumped it up to 900 square feet. So the commission approved that, as well as the language about development on an existing small lots can happen if they can connect to municipal water and sewer. So that's included here. The part about conditional use review of multifamily was sent to the ordinance committee, who reviewed a staff proposal back in the beginning of March, where we provided kind of 4 different alternatives of how the city may approach this particular issue, but made a pretty strong recommendation to remove the conditional review for all residential uses across the city. Our principal reasoning behind that is that, a residential use is a residential use is a residential use. Just because there's more units doesn't mean that the nature of that use has changed. It's just gotten more. So it's not the fact that it makes more noise, it makes more odors or whatever. It just does more of whatever the smaller piece of that does. So we have other tools in the ordinance that are specifically intended to address development as it gets bigger. That's major impact. And we have definitions of what constitutes a major impact that's different in different districts and different for different numbers of units that are being created. That's a much more appropriate tool. So there's some regulatory redundancy here. The purpose of the zoning districts the residential zoning districts is to provide for residential uses. So again, it doesn't make sense that then a residential use should be conditional when that is inherent to the purpose of that district. And there's just confusion in article in the appendix about regulating use versus regulating building type. So we've included as part of this amendment, getting rid of the mixed use building category and just where an understanding that where a non-residential use is permitted, that use is either permitted or conditionally permitted in different districts. It doesn't matter what kind of building it occurs in. It's the use that's being permitted here or not, and it's the residential use. So all of those factors come together to make us see that conditional use doesn't make any sense to begin with. So that is our recommendation, to eliminate that for all residential uses. The practical application of that in the use table is that attached duplexes, instead of being conditional in RL, is a permitted use. Again, there are still restrictions on the size of the lot, the width of the lot, as to whether or not you can do a duplex. Multifamily dwellings, 3 or more, would be permitted in the institutional district instead of conditional. And as I said, we get rid of the attached dwellings mixed use use category in the table, because it's a building type. It's not a particular use in and of itself. So those are the kind of 3 main elements of this particular amendment that we're seeking your action to warn a public hearing for.
Thank you. Did the ordinance, you said the ordinance committee looked at this?
Ordinance committee looked, they only specifically looked to this last issue about permitted versus conditional uses for residential.
Great. Any comments from the ordinance committee on that one? Bruce?
Been so long, I don't remember, but I think we supported it. Definitely the change, but we only looked at the conditional versus permitted use.
Okay. Great. Thanks. Any questions, comments, Jennifer?
So I just want to be clear. This is only applying to duplexes in the change is duplexes in the residential low, right?
In RL, duplexes is the only thing that changes for RL.
Okay, and was there?
The mixed use building then goes away as an option in the table in all districts, so.
Right. And so was there any discussion about larger multifamily in RL?
No,
why was it just duplexes, I guess is my question.
Because in the use table, duplexes are specifically identified as a conditional use. Multifamily units
Are just not allowed.
Otherwise not allowed unless it's a PUD. I think that's a different discussion.
Yeah.
I definitely want to have.
Yeah. Yeah, so the outliers are single family still not in our residential high, and multifamily and residential low. And I guess I would definitely, first of all, agree with this change. I think it's a good change, but I think that the conversation about larger multifamily in residential low is an important conversation to have. And so I would definitely encourage that as something that we bring up at some point. I'm not sure about the single family homes. Maybe that's somebody that lives, maybe Emily has some opinions about that in residential high, but I do think that looking at multifamily is an important broader conversation to have.
Yes, and that will definitely be a topic of the Mayor's Housing Summit.
Great.
That was my question, is when can we have that conversation? Thank you.
Bruce?
One of the things that this would make it very easy to do is if you have an existing building and you're not changing anything in the exterior, and you could essentially apply and obtain a permit rather easily and predictably. And one of the problems is you can work to hire an architect and you only have one unit you're adding to your home, and you may not do it because it's too unpredictable. Just by taking that $2,000 or $3,000 wager off the table and making it more predictable, I think you could encourage this and not change how it looks in the neighborhood very much.
I think this is a good change as well. But one of the things, I think when we talk about these issues during the executive committee and going forward, is there are other residential uses on in the table as well, and we may want to look at those, whether those are. I think some of those are conditional use as well. And just take a look at some of the other types of residential uses and see if conditional use really still makes sense, or if those should be updated to be just either permitted or not permitted, as we're doing here. Any other comments, questions on this proposed amendment? Okay, again, the staff recommendation was to approve the municipal bylaw amendment report and warn for public hearing. Somebody want to make a motion to that effect, or have other discussion, or do something different? Any motions?
Lively crowd tonight.
It is. At least we have you, Alex. Would you like to make a motion?
Do
I'll
we
make a
table it
motion.
for further discussion?
Oh, we could.
I make a motion to accept the changes. I don't think that they're that controversial, and I think that for the love of God, duplexes should be allowed in residential low density.
So
And-
we have a motion to approve the bylaw amendment report and warn for public hearing. Is there a second?
Second.
A second by Jennifer. And Alex, did you?
Second.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I heard you propose putting this off.
No,
Okay,
not at
all
all.
right.
Hey,
Um,
Andy, before you vote, I just wanted to alert you to the fact that Sharon Busher has her hand raised. I don't know if you are interested in taking any questions or comments from the public.
Sure, we could hear on this one.
Okay. Sharon, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, good evening. I read the agenda and normally you allow people to speak during items, so I hope this is okay. I'm Sharon Busher and I wanted to speak on just one section, section 5.4.5, the accessory dwelling amendment that is coming from, I guess, the legislature. My concern is, once again, if there is no restriction on the, the size is restricted to 900 square feet as opposed to 800, and it's still owner occupied, that I have no issue with the size or the owner occupation, but I am concerned about the fact that it does not limit how many bedrooms and how many occupants. And I think I'm a broken record for many of you, but when you live in close proximity to the university, I feel that, the workaround is a parent buys the house for the student, adds the ADU, and now can have multiple bedrooms. And I'm just trying to figure out how this will not erode the for unrelated, which was something that we put in place to try to deal with the creation of what we used to call mini dorms, but just overuse of properties. And I know we need housing, but in some sections of Burlington, I think this can become problematic. It is troubling to me. It remains troubling to me. And for the legislature, so many of them don't have the University of Vermont as their next door neighbor. So I think the protections they've put in place are really good. I think where those neighborhoods that are close to UVM are the outliers and have challenges now that I'm not sure how we will work through. And I really hope that the Planning Commission will look at how this change does fit. I understand the foreign related is not your ordinance, but I just want to make sure that we are consistent and we're not really eroding what we've put in place to deal with quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily?
I guess I want to ask a clarifying question. Sharon's comment is related to the accessory dwelling unit change, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and so the concern, Sharon, is that you're concerned that people are going to put in an accessory dwelling unit and have more than 4 bedrooms in that dwelling unit?
May I respond?
Sure, go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, I'm sorry. Emily, what I'm thinking is that they won't put 4 bedrooms. I think they might. So you've got a house that has maybe 4 bedrooms, and then you add an ADU, and now you might add 2 bedrooms. Maybe, I don't know how many bedrooms you can get in 900 square feet, frankly, if you have small rooms. I really don't know, but I'd say at least 2 bedrooms potentially, and you could have more than one person occupy a bedroom. So that's my concern. Then you've got more than 4 unrelated in this composite on this property that before we had criteria restrictions that said no more than 4 unrelated unless it was a significant, if it was over 2,000 square feet, for every 225 square feet or whatever, you could add another person. So I'm concerned about where this gets us and how the two work together or don't work together. The two ordinances may be in conflict with each other. That's my point.
So may I?
Yes, go ahead, Emily.
So the concern is that an accessory dwelling unit would have 2 bedrooms, but it would really just be a workaround to add 2 more bedrooms to an existing single family home and would function like a 7-bedroom.
Yes, that is my fear. That is my fear. And I know there are lots of good people that wouldn't do that, but there are lots of people who would seize the moment. I see it all around me all the time, people really bending the law and making it work for them and to the disadvantage of the neighborhood.
So both of the changes related to the number of bedrooms and the number of occupants are both driven by the statute. And the fact that we have those in our definition today in Burlington is actually not consistent with the way that the state statute defines an ADU. So those we have interpreted this as we have to remove those standards from our definition because they're not consistent with the way the state defines them. But
more restrictive.
We have, right, the state is more permissive than what we have been, yes. As far as I understand it though, the 4 unrelated applies to every unit on a property within those zoning districts. So whether we, limited the occupancy through the definition of an ADU or whether we use it for 4 unrelated, there's still some tool to ensure that the occupancy of each individual unit in those areas of the city meets the standards that we've talked about as a community.
Can I still say something?
Yes, go ahead, Sharon.
So that, as I understood what Megan just said, was that the ADU could have 4 occupants and the house could have 4 occupants, as opposed to what we had originally proposed, which would have been 1 bedroom with the maximum number of occupants being 2. So it is an expansion. And and it could be detrimental. That's my point. Thank you.
Emily?
I'm not sure how many, I mean, a 900 square foot apartment is quite small. My basement is 1,000 square feet. And you could not put in, to follow code, you couldn't put in more than 2 bedrooms. I mean, maybe you could, I mean, I don't think it's technically very possible to do that, to put in more than a 2-bedroom apartment in 900 square feet. And meet the minimum housing requirements of the size of bedrooms.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot
Anybody
of
else?
things will be dependent on design and building code.
Anybody else? We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on it? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed? Would you do any opposed again? My screen froze up there for a second. Okay, I don't see any opposed. So that looks like it's unanimous. Thank you. We're on to item 7, which is proposed CDO amendment, Article 14 updates.
Okay, so this is kind of a smorgasbord of clarifications, corrections, minor modifications to the form-based code that applies in the downtown and was adopted 2 or 3 years ago now. Really is best practice in these kinds of situations is that when you're trying out a new code, you know, you test drive it, you get it used for a period of time, and then you come back and plug all the things that you didn't quite get right. So with the tremendous help of our friends at in DPI, Scott and Mary and Ryan, they've been sending me over the course of more like a year and a half, 18 months, something like that. All their questions, all their, this doesn't quite look right. What does this mean? This is inconsistent. This just doesn't make any sense at all. Topics. And I finally woven them all together into a single proposed amendment. I tried to summarize kind of the nature of many of these things. As I said, they come largely from staff applying the code in the real world. And we've gotten some good help, not just from our staff, but also when it specifically comes to awnings and canopies. I would shout out to our friends at Otter Creek Awnings who took a tremendous amount of time with me to sit down and explain how do awnings really work, what they can and cannot do physically in order to refine those standards so that we can really see the kinds of awnings we want in our downtown. So the kind of the breadth of this amendment, it attempts to make consistent use of terms and concepts regarding things like encroachments into setbacks. There are examples where we are permitting encroachments into setbacks where no setback is required. That doesn't make any sense. Where parking is located, trying to be really clear about where you can build surface parking, where you can build parking within a structure, either in a separate structure or within a mixed-use building. And the terms glazing and voids. Again, being consistent in how we use those terms, because we care about the transparency of the glazing, but not whether or not across the facade of a building, we're concerned about the percentage of void in that facade, not necessarily that it is glazing or glass. We make clear an exemption for work that's being proposed for either an existing or a proposed public right-of-way or thoroughfare. Classic example of this one is the City Place project, where there are 2 proposed public right-of-ways, but we need to be clear in our understanding that what happens within those right-of-ways is not subject to the code, it's subject to something else, and that would be the Great Streets standards, which are approved, and then those improvements are approved by the Department of Public Works. That's just an area of confusion. It adds new definitions and clarifies the standards for things like awnings and balconies and canopies and decks. Again, trying to be very consistent. You know, what is an awning versus a canopy? What is a balcony versus a deck? They are different. They manifest themselves in different ways. Revising the rear yard setback in Form District 5, basically eliminating it. In the downtown transition district that preceded Form District 5, there was no rear yard setback. And because we include a provision for requiring a setback, a particular setback where Form District 5 is adjacent to a residential district, that really covers the need for having a required rear yard setback. If it's interior to Form District 5, there doesn't need to be one. It adds a new civic space type, specifically focused on Perkins Pier. If you look at the different types of civic space types, none of them really fit Perkins Pier well in terms of the amount of lot coverage there is existing there today, and the kinds of activities and what you can do relative to the shoreline. So we've created a civic space type specifically for that type of activity. The only map amendment that's proposed is revising map 3, which shows where shop fronts are required, showing that specifically then for the new sections of Pine and St. Paul Street that run through City Place. It revises the urban design standards regarding primary materials, balconies and decks and awnings and canopies, as I mentioned before. Consolidates all the standards with regard to fences into one location, rather than having them sprinkled in 3 or 4 different places. When somebody wants to do a fence, they shouldn't have to look 3 different places to find out what do they need to do. It clarifies how the requirements and standards apply to existing and non-conforming structures. That's largely been how the code has been applied most of the time. We've not seen a lot of whole cloth new buildings, but a lot of modifications to existing buildings, and we attempt to be really clear about it. Really just applies to what's being proposed to change, not that you have to then change everything else about the building. We are proposing to expand the authority for administrative relief to any minor variation from the numerical standard. These are things that are often confronted by the staff as they need 6 inches here or they need a foot there. That kind of wiggle room, I think, is entirely appropriate to make sure that these rigid standards can be reasonably applied. And it removes all the references to the planning and zoning department and the director, and replaces them with permitting inspections department and the administrative officer as appropriate. So it's less department specific. So that's the scope, and I'm happy to walk through any of these things and talk about them in greater detail, but there's a bunch. As you see, there's like 20 pages of them.
Okay, thank you. And just to remind the commission that the proposed staff recommendation on this one is to do what Emily just was trying to do, which is to ask questions and provide feedback to staff on the proposed amendments for further discussion at a future meeting. So Emily.
Great, thanks. I was on the committee that worked on form-based code, so all of this is really familiar and remembering a lot of the conversations that we had. So 3 items that I would like to be considered are materials used for decking, and in general, I'd like a consideration for the carbon impact of materials, such as like tropical hardwoods for decking, and in general, materials that have a huge carbon impact and are shipped from far away, deforesting the rainforest, so on and so forth. And then canopies, I think that the code, if I'm correct, requires canopies or architectural features I'd like to consider an exemption for high performance energy buildings, because requiring a canopy on a north side of a building can really affect the performance of a building. I mean, the old adage of form follows function. I mean, canopies serve a purpose, and that is to block the sun. And I don't think we should require them in our climate when there isn't sun on a north slope. And then the materials used for the freestanding wall, we're seeing a lot of new uses for cast concrete, which is actually quite an affordable material. And you saw it used, it's used in City Hall Park. It's, there's those beautiful walls in City Hall Park are all made with cast concrete and are really quite attractive and beautiful and modern. So I don't think we should limit that from being a material. I think a lot of those materials are so nuanced. You know, you can use concrete block and it can look terrible, or you can have a high-end feel of cast concrete. So those are my three recommendations for additions to this.
So Emily, if I could just to be clear in my own head, so decking materials, you want to add we don't have any primary material requirements for anything other than the facade of a building, or the facade. Maybe
Yeah, I just think some sort of reference to a consideration to the carbon impact of the materials that is used.
globally.
Yeah, that there should be a preference for low carbon materials. Like, we as a city, we put in hundreds of square feet of EPay on the waterfront for the boardwalk. We put it on top of a structure that is probably going to fail in the next 20 years. So it's probably going to need to be ripped off before its lifetime. And there was really no consideration. I mean, that's a lot of EPay. That's acres of the Amazon. EPay is like a single tree in an acre of forest that whole forest has to be deforested to get that single tree. It has a huge carbon impact. We saw it in the city, the marina that's down, the brand new marina, just acres of EPay. I mean, it's just, there are other materials that can be used. And I don't think we think about it. And so if there was some reference to it in the code, I think it might make people stop and think for a second about the choices on materials and where they're going. There is sustainable EPay. There are sustainably harvested hardwoods. There are some local options, like black locust is a local option that, a lot of people say, oh, well, there's not an availability of black locust. And one of the reasons that there's not an availability of black locust is because there's not a market for it, because people are building with EPay. And if we didn't allow EPay anymore, there'd be more of a market for local sustainable wood. So, white cedar is another durable wood that can be used in place of these tropical hardwoods. So I'd like to see some language about consideration for the carbon impact of the materials, and some sort of way out of some of the design standards. If you're trying to build a really high efficiency, like a net zero building, and you're being asked to put on a canopy on the north slope of the north side of a building, it can really set you back in trying to meet those metrics.
So I don't know that there's any requirement to add an awning or a canopy or a deck. It says where, what does it say? Where provided.
Yeah, I think
you need to follow these standards.
Again, I think that it's like the YMCA, and I know Scott worked on that project, and it is a beautiful building, Scott, and you did a great job. But the YMCA, on the north side of the YMCA, there's canopies. And it's a design feature. It's supposed to make the building look like it has a top, right? And that's great, except for that it doesn't actually have any function. that the north side of the building doesn't need a canopy. Canopies are.
So I want to be clear
supposed
about our use of terms though, because that's particularly for the form-based code, lots of things are very specifically defined. So you're talking about the hat, the top of a building,
No, it's a canopy. It's
as
a
opposed to a canopy over a
projection.
window or an entrance or.
Yeah, I was looking at the definition here. Canopy are typically rectangular in both elevation and cross-section, shall have straight edges and no arches or curves, may be pitched to shed water off the side and placed over a building entrance. So yeah, there seems to be some canopies on that. I feel like we're having a conversation about canapes, which are delicious. So anyways, I would just love some language that someone could point to if they were trying to build something that is a super high performance building, that they could point to it and say, hey, here's the language in the code that says that, you know, that we're open to some leeway when someone is trying to build a building that is high performance.
Okay, I'll see what I can come up with. And I know that we talked about cast concrete and, you know, is it smooth? Is it textured? How do you define what it means to be textured? And
Yeah,
how much,
it's a
you
tough
know,
one.
that gets a little tricky because we actually, just, as we talked about, we specifically referred to those walls in City Hall Park going, well, that's cast concrete.
And it's beautiful.
And it's, yeah, but there's other examples where you're seeing, you know, is that what it means to be a finished building wall or building material or not? But we'll dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, there's just a lot of modern buildings, I think, that are successful are using cast concrete. And it's a, you know, it seems to be affordable and it can be beautiful and it's more of a modern use of that material. So it's nuanced how to make it successful and write a code around it. So maybe it's easier just to say you can't do it because it can be done poorly. But you know, we did use it in City Hall Park and it looks gorgeous. So I wouldn't want to limit someone from doing something of that quality in a building because we did it in City Hall Park.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Any other questions, comments? Bruce?
Just a comment to Emily's, I think the ePay comment is a good one. It seems to me there is sustainably harvested ePay
Great.
that receives some sort of independent certification from, I don't know, it's like the Forestry Stewardship Council. And I just want to make that comment so we may be able to make a better, maybe able to have it all in your proposal.
Anyone else? So just one comment I have is there, you know, as David said, when we were doing the form-based code, going into it and as it was going through the adoption process, we always talked about that within a couple of years or so, we'd have to go through and, you know, just do the updates, revisions as we get the, see how it's actually being used. And so David, thank you for going through and doing all of this work. I wonder if it would be worth having this go to the ordinance committee just to go through it, read the language, just make sure, you know, everything in it is, you know, consistent, making sense, that just have a second, almost another set of eyes on it. I don't think as a full group we're going through it in that level of detail, but just a thought, seeing if that's something that the ordinance committee would like to take on. I don't know that it would have to delay the process at all, really, but work with David to go through and just go through it with him. And at the same time, consider the question that was raised by the person earlier at the public forum.
You know, I think a workshop sort of atmosphere like that where we sit and sort of spade out the language is a good way to do that, something like that.
David, does that work on your side of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it could be helpful. Jennifer?
Thanks. I had a question about the parking and circulation, the changes, and I think I'm looking at right thing, but was just wondering why the definitions or the descriptions of structured parking had changed and what you were trying to achieve with that. And it's on page 13, I think.
It's in one of the tables. Or
No, it's in the text. Am I looking at the right thing?
do you have a line number?
Yep, hold on. Looks like line 277 through 280. So it was talking about being in a perimeter building, enclosed below the finished grade, blah, blah, blah. And then it's changes within a principal building type and located underground above the second story or in the ground floor. And it was just a little confusing. So I was just wondering sort of what was behind that change.
So it's also reflected in parking location in the for each of the form districts. But basically, structures and garages are just what they sound like. They are physical structures that you park a car in, as opposed to a parking lot or a parking area that is surface parking. That's kind of one principle to keep in mind. A perimeter building is a building that would not have any parking within it, but it sits in front of a parking structure or garage that's separate from it. So there's been some confusion about, well, maybe this is a perimeter building and I'm then trying to put parking inside of it. No, a perimeter building doesn't have parking inside of it. It has parking behind it, typically inside of a structure. So that's where the principal building type, other than a perimeter building, then you could put the parking underneath it. You could put the parking at or above the second story, or you could put the parking on the first story as long as it's set back into the third lot layer, i.e. 20 feet from the facade, and there is an active street level use in front of it. So it's trying to tease out the differences between different types of principal buildings and where and how they either incorporate parking within them or parking in a separate structure behind them.
Okay. So the impact is still essentially the same on the street level user, which is that it's not just sort of an unrestricted, it's an unrestricted like parking garage right on street level. And
correct. So if you're standing
like we used to have on Cherry Street.
Yeah, you shouldn't experience of parking, parked cars at street level right there next to you. They could be above you.
Right, or they could be underground.
They could be underground, or they're set back with an active street level use between you and it. So, and we included a definition of what is an active street level use because we got into this a little bit with, I think, City Place and what kinds of, they wanted to put some, storage and almost some utility kind of space between the parked cars and the street. Well, it doesn't do anything to activate the street. So we tried to add some clarity to that.
Yeah, it doesn't add a lot. Okay, yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I wasn't totally clear what you're driving at there.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. Anybody else? Harris?
Yeah, thanks, David, for putting this all together. There's a lot here. Can you just explain a little bit, maybe more in detail, the example you said about the changes in civic spaces relating to Perkins Pier?
Happy to. So you will probably recall a zoning amendment we did a few years ago where for all of the parks, not every single park, but for several groupings of parks, we identified specific lot coverage limits for different groups of parks. Recognizing that zoning them as RCO with a 5% lot coverage limit doesn't make sense for a place like City Hall Park or Perkins Pier that has pretty high lot coverage, it's fine for the arms grant. So that continues, those specific lot coverage requirements for different parks continues outside of the form district, but it never got carried into the form districts. Then specifically as it applies to Perkins Pier, which has pretty high lot coverage because of the large surface parking lot there. So there's some planning going on, kind of thinking about the future of Perkins Pier and how it might be redesigned and reused. So one of the questions that kind of came up was, geez, you know, well, it's identified in the form-based code as a civic space, which it is, but which one is it? You know, because it doesn't fit within any of the boxes that were created. So this is an intention to create a civic space type that Perkins Pier would fit into, as well as other future civic spaces that are on the waterfront. You might think of the north end of the waterfront. It's places where there are water dependent activities and uses there. So this beginning in line 92 creates a civic space type for water dependent recreation and related facilities. It includes a high lot coverage because whether it's Perkins Pier as it is now, or it's something like the new marina, they typically going to have a lot of hard surface. That's not necessarily inconsistent from a stormwater perspective. It just means that it's trickier for them to manage their stormwater and to contain it. That's a different issue. But they typically have a high degree of lot coverage, and we needed to or wanted to include then the setback requirements for structures and buildings like we have within the public trust district, which is not in the form. I don't know if that answers your question or makes it more confusing.
Yeah, thanks. It's a lot more detail. It's still a lot to get my head around, so, but thank you.
Good, thanks. Anyone else? So this will go to the ordinance committee and hopefully come back, you know, in a timely way. Great. Thank you again. Thank you again, David. Oh, who was that?
Could I just ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
You mentioned that in your suggestion to send this to the ordinance committee to also include the request from Amy Gagnon about the boundaries. Is that something that the committee wants, or that the council wants us to look at as well when this goes? Okay.
I mean, I don't know what the outcome of that discussion will be, but
Right.
as long as we're taking a global look at, you know, general amendments to this section, we might as well look at that as well.
Okay.
So anything that Megan, that you or David could add to that discussion would be really helpful. Any recommendations that you might have would be real helpful. Item 8 is commissioner items. Our next two meetings are May 11th and May 25th. Any other commissioner items? Oh, and there's a reminder, if you're reapplying to be a commissioner, the deadline is May 14th.
Andy?
Yes.
Like Harris, I've been on the planning commission for a long time, so have decided that I am not going to reapply. Really enjoyed working with all of you, and it's been exciting to do many of the things that we've worked together on, but I think it's time to let somebody have a chance at the spot, a new person with a fresh perspective. So I'm gonna not be reapplying.
Well, Jennifer, you've been really appreciated here on the Planning Commission. Your service has been really great. So thank you for all that you've done here.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yes, it has been. Anybody else? So we're going to have some changes on the Planning Commission. 2 members stepping down. Wow. Anyone else? All right, then we'll move to item 9, which are minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept communications?
So moved.
Motion by Alex, seconded by Harris. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, that's unanimous. And last item is adjournment. Motion to adjourn
So moved.
by Harris, seconded by Emily. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
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 Stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a good